gather ourselves and take a seat. We'll get started. Thanks everyone for being here. The topic is, of course, of little interest these days, and the weather doesn't seem to have had much of an impact. We are still waiting on Sherry Gay-Dagnogo. She's coming up from Detroit, so I expect, given the road situation, she may be a little late, but we'll get started. My name is Arnold Weinfeld. I'm Associate Director at the Michigan State University Institute for Public Policy and Social Research. And as I said, we're very pleased to host this forum on redistricting in what seems to be a very timely manner. I'm going to introduce our panelists generally, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Mac Grossman, the director at IPPSR, who's going to moderate today's discussion. So with us today is, we'll start on the end there with Jamie Lyons-Eddy. Jamie is the Executive Director for Voters Not Politicians and the Voters Not Politicians Education Fund. Jamie is also a founding member of Voters Not Politicians, and she was the State Field Director for the ballot campaign that established the current redistricting process. Next to Jamie is Tony Daunt, who's the Executive Director of Fair Maps Michigan. He's also a member of the State Board of Canvassers and has a long history of involvement in Michigan politics. And we're happy to say Tony is also a graduate of IPPSR's Michigan Political Leadership Program. Thank you. Go Green. John Eguia is a professor of economics at Michigan State University and affiliated with the Department of Political Science and IPPSR at MSU. He has published academic research on partisan fairness in redistricting and was the lead author of the IPPSR report on the 2021 Michigan redistricting maps. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Mac Grossman.
Thank you all for being here. We have a bit of a microphone situation, but we're going to muddle through. For the start, I'd like to give everybody a chance to introduce themselves and talk about their role in the process, and then we will integrate Sherry when she arrives. So I believe Jamie is the fourth representative from Voters Not Politicians that we've had at these forums over the years. So it's been a long process, and good to hear about it from the beginning. So we'll start with Jamie.
Hi everybody. I was in charge of recruiting and training and organizing the 6,500 volunteers who collected more than 440,000 signatures, went on to knock 465,000 doors in order to get Proposal 18-2 on the ballot and passed in Michigan. I'm now Executive Director of Voters Not Politicians, which continues to do really good work on nonpartisan good government issues. In order to create a nonpartisan solution to gerrymandering, a group of volunteers wrote the ballot language that became Proposal 18-2 and was incorporated into the Constitution after 61% of Michigan voters supported it. That ballot language was supported by surveys filled out by 1,000 different people who attended our 33 town halls that we gave around the state back in March of 2017. And most importantly, the amendment removes politicians from the redistricting process and requires transparency and public input. The commission is made up of regular Michigan citizens, 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, 5 who self-identify as not affiliated with either of those major parties, and that commission must follow strict criteria when adopting congressional and legislative district maps. So that starts with federal requirements, including the VRA, including respect for communities of interest, avoiding advantage for any political party or incumbent, and then respecting geographic boundaries and preserving reasonable compactness in the maps. About the court-ordered redraw, I know that's what we're going to talk about. I'm looking forward to digging in. But just to start, I will say that VNP is pleased to see how much this commission accomplished in just 2 short weeks of mapping and listening to the public. Voters gave the commission exclusive authority. That is the language that was on your ballot back in fall of 2018. Exclusive authority to adopt district maps for our congressional and legislative districts, and that's exactly what needs to happen here. I have faith that the commission will produce maps that allow historically marginalized communities to elect the candidates of their choice, that keep communities of interest together, and that maintain partisan fairness. The last thing I'll say is we can have a huge, well-trained, highly engaged volunteer force. Several of them are here today, distributed all over Michigan. They're focused on strengthening democracy with policies that work for every voter across the political spectrum, and these volunteers remain steadfastly committed to defending and preserving independent redistricting here in Michigan. And thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, and I should have mentioned we've asked the panelists just for a very brief introductory remark so that we can get into spending most of our time in discussion and Q&A. So next up is Tony Daunt, who's also been involved in this process from the beginning on the more skeptical side, and was also involved in the successful or supporting the successful litigation that led to the redrawing. Tony.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me. I got involved with the redistricting process in 2017, essentially because I was really craving the pulsing pain in my eyeball for the next 7 years. It's a really in-depth, complex topic, and more seriously, my reason for involvement in 2017 was I was, no secret, I was opposed to the ballot initiative. I was one of the voices that led the effort, the unsuccessful effort to defeat this. Spent a lot of time in green rooms and discussion with Dave, Mr. Waymeyer, and Katie Fahey, and we had a very strong difference of opinion, but I think ultimately it was a great process to be part of. Consistent debates, laying out your arguments, doing so in a civil fashion, and then letting the voters decide. Some of my reasons, and the folks that I've worked with on this, some of the reasons for being opposed to it and fighting so strongly against it was, I thought that putting 13 kind of random citizens in charge of this process was destined to experience some pretty severe unintended consequences. Lack of accountability, soaring costs, and ultimately being reliant on experts. And if those experts were giving you bad advice and leading you in the wrong direction, it was likely, given your lack of expertise, that you would follow them down the path. And I think we saw that towards the end of the process in 2021 when numerous commissioners, and this came out in the trial as well, they expressed concern with what Mr. Adelson, what Bruce Adelson, the VRA consultant, was instructing them to do. They went along with it anyways, and folks in Detroit filed the plaintiffs that filed suit, and ultimately you got a 3-0 decision in favor of the plaintiffs that it was in fact bad advice, it was a racial gerrymander. And since that decision, although the last couple of weeks have seen more work done by this commission than we saw leading up to it, was really a posture of defiance and infighting, and I think it was a disservice ultimately to the people of Michigan, particularly the people in the city of Detroit who brought the suit. Moving forward, we're excited to see, or anxiously awaiting what the commission is going to put forward as their solution, and then there's about 5 or 6 additional steps between that and final adoption by this 3-judge panel. So I look forward to speaking about this, and again, thanks for having me.
As most of you know, IPPSR has been involved in this process from the beginning. Before the commissioners were appointed, we helped produce some of their orientation materials, but we've attempted to help the commission, but also be straight shooters throughout, and to the extent that our reports were also referenced in the decision that struck down the commission maps. And the leader in all of that has been John. As most of you know, this process really comes down to people who are both have to be math geeks and very interested in the substance and the sort of philosophical principles behind the mapping. And that's a unique combination of expertise that not very many people share. So we're very pleased that John joined our effort. John.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, everyone. Yes, I got my PhD in the California Institute of Technology in social sciences. It was a very mathematical program, but devoted to political science. And my thesis is on how groups make decisions, how we make collective decisions when we have disparate preferences. And that's very exciting to me. I worked at New York University Department of Politics there before coming to Michigan State. But it's academic is fairly niche, and then when these redistricting questions come up, that's when, oh, well, now that expertise is relevant because this is a large group, namely 10 million Michiganders, who are struggling or deciding or having challenges in deciding how they're going to make this particular decision of how they're going to run their elections. So it was very exciting to me to put my scientific research interests to have a direct implication in the world around me as a citizen. I became a volunteer for Voters Not Politicians that did not knock on any door, but I helped in other ways. I got 0 signatures. Then in my own research on redistricting, I published work on partisan fairness, how to measure partisan fairness, which was my sticking point with the language. The constitutional language says according to accepted measures. I've been to those conferences. We each accept our own measure. That's roughly, so 6 experts, 6 measures, or 7 or 8. So that led me to research, well, what would be measures that would be accepted? At the time, no court had ever accepted any measure, so I wanted to develop research, propose a measure that was more aligned with what the courts have been saying in their objections to pre-established measures. So that was that's my scientific research work, published in academic journals. And then in terms of being involved with the Michigan specific 2021 process, I participated in those IPPSR, education and training for the commission. I do acknowledge the caveats and the problems of bringing 13 citizens that Tony mentioned. My take, right, and Tony's is, yes, these are the problems, let me do everything I can. Let us experts do everything we can to help the commission, train the commission, and alleviate or mitigate those concerns that Tony mentioned. So that's where I saw my role, and then in my own work, try to help the commission, providing expertise, information, reports. It was a dual goal of help the commission while the commission is working, and then evaluate whatever the commission has done, whether it is listening to what I said or not, evaluate so that the public, and ultimately I wasn't expecting that, but the public and the courts then are better informed, so bring in that expertise for the service, first of the commission as first dibs, but then ultimately for everybody. So our work was picked up in the court order, but there were problems with the advice that the commission received, and many of us have been saying so. So that's the type of work that we're trying to do. Now the commission is again doing, so we're trying to help the commission. I proposed a map that put forth as public comment, with another report just yesterday. I think today the commission updated on their 15 drafts. So as long as they're working, I see my role of, insofar as I can help, being available expertise. Once that they're working, we'll do evaluation, and I'm not working for the commission, so I'm working for the state of Michigan for my appointment at Michigan State University. So in the end, I'm trying to help the commission. Once they're done, I try to provide all that I know so that any of you can read it and become as informed as I am to then evaluate what the commission do. So hopefully the commission will do great, and I will give arguments for Jamie to defend what the commission did. And if the commission does poorly, then I'll give arguments for Tony to criticize the commission. That's my role. While they're working, trying to help as much as I can, and afterwards evaluate what they did. That's my role.
So we're still expecting Sherry within 5 to 10 minutes, but we'll kind of proceed and then have Sherry give her introduction when she arrives. So let's start with Jamie. Looking back now, what has gone better than expected on the Commission's behalf? What has gone about as you expected, and what hasn't gone as well as the volunteers would have hoped?
Here, I'm gonna use this one. I think that works.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. So there were a couple questions in there about what's been better than expected, what's gone about as like we thought, and what maybe went better than expected. One thing I have to highlight that I don't know if everybody realized happened that I was very pleased about is that I think you heard that 3 of the commissioners had to be replaced just before this process of the redraw started. I just want to actually take a moment to acknowledge one of those commissioners actually passed away a couple of days ago, who was convalescing in California, which is part of the reason he dropped out of the commission. They had to replace 3 really quickly, right before they started mapping again. They randomly chose 3 names from the party buckets in the semifinalist pool, and all 3 of those people showed up the next day, were sworn in, and are now digging in and doing a great job. I was really impressed by that. I thought, they applied to serve, 4 years ago? I thought surely somebody that they picked would say, no thanks, or what? I signed up for what? And they showed up and they're doing a great job. So there's this public service element to this role that I think is really encouraging and exciting. I want to remind everybody too, several obstacles came up for this commission in the original process that were completely not anticipated. One of those is that the census data was incredibly late for everybody all around the country. Another was COVID, right? That this commission had to deal with how to have public hearings when they couldn't do anything in public. Their schedule got very squeezed. They still managed to do well over the number of public hearings that was required. I will acknowledge that some of the advice given to the commission by their consultants missed the mark. That's pretty clear from the court's decision. What's also clear, Judge Neff wrote in a concurring opinion there that the commissioners and the consultants were clearly trying to do the right thing, and I think that's really important to remember. They missed the mark, but nobody has suggested that anybody had any ill intent here or was trying to do anything wrong by anybody in the state, and certainly not, they were not trying to do wrong by Detroit voters. But it is pretty disappointing that the commission was given advice that led to the court finding that they violated the Equal Protection Clause. I just want to conclude by just saying right here today, in spite of several bumps in the road, several challenges, this process is still so much better than maps being drawn in secret by and for politicians.
Yeah.
Thank you. Now John gets the hard part of trying to explain the dilemma that the commission felt that it faced between not having race be the primary consideration based on the 14th Amendment and creating districts that were districts of opportunity for the Voting Rights Act. How did they sort of get into this mess, and how might those be in potential conflict or were seen as in conflict by the commission?
So with the caveat to the advantage that I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not as careful with my words as there's a little of tension in that the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution itself, the Equal Protection Clause that was invoked to rule these districts unconstitutional, if it's not fully colorblind, race blind, it comes pretty close. It's a traditional liberal idea of race doesn't matter, it shouldn't matter. Don't look at people on the basis of race. Kind of a universal spirit from the Enlightenment of do not divide us by race. Quoting the opinion, mapping voters by race in districts is odious, it says. Counter that, 100 years later in the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s and thereafter, the Voting Rights Act has a different sensibility that says, well, this full blindness, we miss out something. We need some sort of affirmative action, some sort of extra protection, some considerations of race to make sure that we truly protect those that are not sufficiently protected by this impartial, blank, neutral. So that's the fundamental tension between those shall not look at race anywhere, anyhow, which is not quite, but versus the no, but do please look to make sure that these people in particular are not hurt. So under the Voting Rights Act, some groups, not just African Americans, but linguistic groups, so those of us who speak Spanish as a main language, we have the special protections that many of you don't have. So that tension creates some difficulties in putting where is the line. And to my understanding, the line is, if you're going to look at race, you need to have a pretty good reason. That's, in the legal jargon would be compelling state interest. And satisfying the Voting Rights Act is such a compelling state interest. The somewhat crude way that I tell my friends that are not following, they want to know what happened, is like, look, is it okay to ask someone whether they have sexually transmitted diseases? And it's like, well, in general, no, I don't. That would not be a natural thing for me to just ask Sherry. But there are specific circumstances in which it is okay. If you're a doctor treating something, if you are thinking of establishing a relationship that could be romantic and sexual with this person, in those scenarios, it is a legitimate question. But only those scenarios. We don't just start asking. Similarly, looking at the race, there are reasons under which it is legitimate, namely to satisfy the Voting Rights Act. Now, the Voting Rights Act, again, I'm paraphrasing what it's nuanced, but my understanding of it is that if there is a majority of an ethnic, linguistic, or racial group, in this case, wherever there is a majority, wherever there is a chunk of people large enough to create a district, now 90,000 people, a majority of which are black, if you have that scenario, that majority of blacks should be able to get the candidates of their choice. That does not require that they get a black elected. That does not, sometimes misunderstood. It's not about counting how many blacks in the House. It could be 0, it could be all of them. That does not mean that they need to be a majority in the district. That if they could do with fewer, that's fine too. But they need to be, so that in the end, whoever they want gets elected. And whoever that gets elected doesn't mean the white Democrats want because they beat the common for Republican. It means win the primary and win the general election. And that, putting numbers as to how exactly you make that sure, operationalizing that is tricky, and that's where the Commission had trouble. But if it doesn't require 50% African American in that group, it comes pretty close. So I don't have good signs for it, but at a conference in December, where the people say, as a rule of thumb, 45% or above probably works in most districts. And the court also said that, that's kind of a floor. And the adults on advice took that as a ceiling. So what's the minimum? It took it as a maximum. So just make sure they never get over that. That was a very complicated advice. So that was the tension. But in the end, the precise terms, our lawyers employed a huge compensation to debate the nuances. But basic idea, it's don't look at race unless you have a very good reason. And a very good reason is to make sure that African American voters do not get shafted in the process. That if there are a majority locally, they should be able to elect whoever they want. Those are the principles. Don't look at race unless you have a very good reason. Making sure that black majority areas get whoever those voters want is a good reason.
Thanks to John for taking us off the uncomfortable topics of race with his analogy. We're pleased that Sherry came and joined us, and so I want to give a chance to her to tell about her involvement in this process and her role now. That's fine.
So thank you all, and it is great to be here, coming from Detroit and coming to this trek that I've traveled for 6 years, and it's great to see so many familiar faces. Today is my 57th birthday. So it's great to spend my birthday working with you all on an issue that is very important to me. And John, I just have to say, I mean, you're my new best friend now, based on your comments and the work that you've been doing and things that I've read. on your opinion on, I shouldn't just say opinion, but the facts about the guidelines for redistricting. I serve as the plaintiff agent and spokesperson for AGV Benson. Many of you who've watched the whole redistricting process, you may or may not know that there was another lawsuit prior to this one that was at the Michigan Supreme Court. And because we did not have an expert as identified in the VRA claims process, that case was ultimately not successful. I'm grateful that this case was successful because I know firsthand in campaigning in communities, oftentimes for people that may not look like me, it's quite challenging. And I know also that races for redistricting, or for, I should say, in urban communities, they're one in the primary, especially in the city of Detroit. They're one in the primary. And so the data that was used in the case for AGV Benson, it's clear that the data was not correct. And so if you don't start with the right data to begin with, the whole process is flawed. A lot of tension has gone forward, and I had to make myself clear in a couple of meetings with commissioners, many of which I believe came to this work with great intentions. And I think oftentimes when we hear take the politics out of the process, I get the negative connotation sometimes that politicians or people who've been elected have. Even though I've been elected a few times, I still don't see myself quite as a politician. But nonetheless, you take away institutional memory as well. And so I used to have the same negative thought process about some of my lobby friends in the room. But I learned later that, you know, they're a wealth of information. And our House of Representatives and Senate as well wouldn't be successful as it is if it wasn't for that institutional memory that exists with a lot of the staff, a lot of the lobbyists, a lot of people who have worked here for a lot of years longer than reps that exist now due to term limits. And so a great deal was lost in that process. And so I've come to this role of working directly with members on both sides of the aisle. And that unnerves some people because it's important to me as a Black woman to make sure that we do have proper representation in the city of Detroit. And after reading the opinion by Judge Kethledge and sitting through many of those court sessions, I was so proud of all the plaintiffs that stepped forward to say that we deserve a right to elect a candidate of our choice from our community. And so if you understand the city of Detroit, if you understand and have looked at the maps and how they've been cut up into 22 pieces with only 7 members living in the city of Detroit, and as someone who is proud, the Honorable Teola P. Hunter was dancing at my party last night. The first female speaker, floor leader, and in the history of the legislature, and to look at her as someone as my mentor, to look at the late Barbara Rose Collins, to look at the late Alma G. Stallworth, to look at the late Coleman Young, to look at Carolyn Cheese Kilpatrick. These are all people that I patterned my leadership after, and those who are no longer with us are turning over in their grave to think that we lost 20% of African American leadership in the House throughout many urban communities in the city of Detroit. Basically, we would have no Black senator if in the next upcoming election, or majority minority seat. So I come to this work as the advocate, as a spokesperson, and again, I give all the kudos and the praise to all the plaintiffs that step forward. It's a lot of work trying to reach out and communicate with them and make sure that their voices are heard in this process, and I speak on behalf of them, not just for myself, although I'm extremely passionate about this issue as well. But we are working to make sure that as we move forward, hopefully that the people in the community will understand the process even better as we move forward to select the next set of maps that will hopefully be compliant with VRA and the equal protections that exist in the 14th Amendment. So thank you for having me here, and looking forward to this conversation.
So Tony, the two sides in the litigation went to the trouble of getting experts together and a lot of testimony, and then the decision essentially ignored much of the expert testimony because they said it's all on the record what the commission did. It was an entirely, every minute was transcribed, and even that part they tried to do in private didn't end up in private. So is this a case that is just sort of the two sides of transparency here, that we saw what happened this time, and the trouble was in seeing that, what usually goes on behind the scenes?
That's a good question. I think, obviously, as I laid out in my intro, I had and still have significant concerns with this process and how it's done and how it may play out in future cycles. Perhaps there's a way to address some of those that fix some of these unintended consequences moving forward. If anything, it just happens to be, don't hire people like Bruce Adelson moving forward to give you bad advice. I think that's a win. But one positive is the transparency that was part of this. And I've been, in my role with the Michigan Freedom Fund over the years, prior to joining Fair Maps, I was always an advocate for transparency from the government. The more we see from their discussion and their decision, the better off we are, and it keeps them honest. And so that transparency piece was critical to prosecuting this case. And the three-judge panel referenced the transcriptions and the video hearings repeatedly throughout their decision. And so I think that's one plus. And whatever you're doing redistricting-wise, whether it's a commission, some hybrid, or you're still having the legislature do it, not here in Michigan, but in other states, transparency is key because you can see what decisions are going to be made and based upon what data. And I think the decision was fairly clear that they were given terrible advice. And I think, the transparency was nice, but what would have been nicer was if the commissioners who were really struggling with that advice that they were being given had trusted their better instincts and basically rejected it and done what they had wanted to do all along, which was properly align these districts with the geography and frankly, the racial makeup of the city of Detroit. Detroit is a heavily African American city. The majority of African Americans in the state of Michigan are concentrated there. And so, you can't help but have districts that have high black voting age population. One of the things you're to avoid either cracking or packing in the VRA. And what they basically did in this instance was crack. They cracked the numbers far too low, and they did so improperly. They were not meeting VRA compliance, and they talked about race, and so they trapped themselves. It's difficult to have a claim of packing in a city like Detroit, where you've got 70, 80, 85% of the population is African American. And I think the commission ultimately, at least a good number of members knew that, but it was drilled into their heads so much by the expert that they became afraid of that and ultimately made the wrong decision.
Sherry, the commission is about to go back to Detroit to hear from residents about their new proposed maps. What went wrong the first time in terms of listening to the citizens of Detroit and getting input, and what can they do this time?
So thank you. I think the biggest thing is not listening to Detroiters. I mean, if you looked at the first round of meetings that were held in the city of Detroit, I mean, there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people that went down to give testimony. And when you look at the commissioners and a lot of the comments that people were saying, it was clear they weren't listening to them. They had their heads down, they were, otherwise engaged. And then once I went to court and listened to the testimony and the evidence that was shared in court, they were told to not listen. That was the part that was so insulting. They were told not to listen, and while I give some grace to a number of the commissioners, there's one that I really take issue with, and that's Commissioner Eade. I shamelessly have my Wayne State notepad today, so Michigan State. But he was kicked out of Wayne State for lying, and it's been investigated that he had other issues with taking jobs that were in conflict with his role as a commissioner. But he specifically was on record as stating that the people of St. Clair Shores, maybe we should listen to them. They better know their neighborhood. They understand their communities better. But when it came to Detroit, they have an agenda, as if it was a negative agenda. The only agenda that the people in the city of Detroit had and has is that they wanted to make sure the data that was being used was the right data, and that they were being heard to keep true communities of interest together. That was the mistake. Not listening to the people, thinking that they could superimpose what their understanding of what was priority versus what the people of Detroit who live there believe was priority. And so that's the biggest issue. Last week, I have to say that the biggest issue was out of spending $7 million to fight this case in court, I would venture to say they probably didn't spend $7 on marketing to get the word out that there were meetings being held last week. There was basically no one. It was a waste of money to go to Huntington Place, where people who are already disenfranchised would have to pay for parking, would have to have no transportation to get downtown in inclement weather, and then have it at the Cadillac Place. I mean, it was very poor planning. So no thought into how do we do outreach for real. Let's reach out. Let's have it at churches. Let's have it at high schools. Let's have it at Wayne County Community College, where parking is free. But no one thought about that. And so when you have blinders on and don't understand the conditions and the socioeconomic barriers that exist in a community, sometimes you make decisions that further hurt people that you claim you're trying to help, because that's what this referendum was all about, right? So it didn't help the people of Detroit, it hurt them in this process. And so I'm hopeful that the majority of the commissioners will be listening now. And I have to say that Zatella, Lang, Aaron, there's a couple of others, and I hate to call names, but they've been going out of their way to make sure that they are trying to listen to the voice of the people this round. And so they shouldn't have that negative stigma that exists as a cloud over the entire commission. We know many of them made mistakes. Tony, you said you wish that more of the commissioners would have listened to their followed their gut instinct. But when you're new to a process like this, and you're listening to an attorney, and just lay citizens, you assume the attorney is a lot smarter or knows more than you. And so they were put in a very precarious situation with Bruce Adelson and the experts. So I think that this process needs to be revised in the legislature so that some framework and guardrails can be put in place. So the next time we have a redistricting process, we don't find these same fault lines that exist from lay citizens who signed up to simply try and serve their community. So I give them kudos, I give them grace, I just take issue with Eve. Thank you.
John, the commission's attorneys have now swung back the pendulum, whereas before they knew that they needed exactly 35 to 45% black voting age population in each of these districts. Now they do not see color, they do not know where anyone lives in Detroit, and they're supposed to be doing it without race in mind. There has to be a happy medium between those two.
Yes, and there is. So I was going to say here that one possible solution to the expert mislead you is get you more experts, because people like me were screaming in our room against Adelson So if you get two experts, you're going to get two opinions. They're not going to agree. So then you're freer to do what you want, backed by one of the experts within some realm. So, in some sense, the legal counsel of the Commission, are going to Matt's question, is going that route now. What Matt said was true as of yesterday, up to the Voting Rights Act analysis and the legal counsel. But today, just this morning, right before this, they had their other legal team, because now the court ordered their legal counsel to be split between VRA counsel and just general counsel. I get lost in the details, but essentially a wall of separation between some lawyers for the Commission and some other lawyers for the Commission. And today's part of the wall was arguing that yes, they can look at race, that what yesterday's lawyers were saying is only part of the part, but that, so in the end, yes, they can and they will look at race, and they are looking at race today. I had to switch off to come here, but it goes back to what I was doing before. You can always look at race if it's for a good reason, namely to follow the Voting Rights Act, making sure that a minority community that is a local majority can get its candidates of choice elected. That's a good reason. Using race to make sure that that same community never has a majority anywhere, that's not a good reason. That basically was the problem with the adults and adults. But they can look at race, and they are looking at race starting today. It's just that they wait, and I don't think it's that bad. I see some merit in start drawing a map that is no race whatsoever, so you cannot be accused of preponderance or predominant attention to race. And then once you have that map, which is what the ones they have now look at race insofar as you need to satisfy the Voting Rights Act. If they do this second part, like the 1-2 steps of first no race, and then let's fix it as need be with minimal targeted attention, modest changes. That's something that I heard the lawyer say today. So I think that makes sense to me. The combination of yesterday's lawyer plus today's lawyer made a lot more sense to me than just the picture that I had up to yesterday, which was no attention to race whatsoever. So it's only a couple of days. I need to come up with something by the end of the week, but I'm hopeful as to what they come up in the next 2 weeks. I think, well, at least I hope there will be a lot more satisfying to the people that share it, which is to represent, and will alleviate the concerns that we've heard. I guess I'm somewhere in between. If I share the optimism, while also hearing the critical concerns as well. But with today's advice, they're no longer in the no race. That was kind of first draw them up with no race, then fix it as need be in a tailored, particular, modest way. I think that to me is an approach that makes sense.
So we have a lot of local complaints about the commission, but actually until they lost the lawsuit, Michigan had been viewed as kind of the national model for the success of this kind of reform. We were one of the only states that went from maps that were perceived as partisan gerrymandered to not. We were also one of the few states where commissions did not directly come into partisan factions and stay that way for the length of the deliberations. So is it still possible that we'll be a national model, and are the next 2 weeks critical to making that happen?
Yes and yes. We've actually, several people on our staff, this has been kind of a crazy time for us, and we're obviously really concerned. We're really concerned that the commission, that the process that was backed by the vast majority of Michiganders retains the faith of the public. We think there's an opportunity to strengthen the process, and that's what's happening now. You've heard from my fellow panelists several things that people think can be improved and are being improved and are being addressed. This remains a completely transparent process, as has been mentioned, and that's part of the reason that any of us knows. It's part of the reason that the lawsuit even happened. It's part of the reason that we know that there has been a certain amount of conflict among the commissioners. That transparency has allowed all of us to be part of this process. And it also allows all of us to give input and help it along. And I think everything that we're hearing is strengthening the process and putting us in better position to go forward. I have a lot of faith. I think that what they've done in the last 2 weeks has been really quite impressive. I agree that I think everybody broadly agreed that they were not getting enough Detroit voices at the table, and they had a town hall last week on Thursday that I know, Sherry, you were able to be there and give some encouragement to the commission, and that they are now hiring, they put out a request for a public relations firm to really get out the word in Detroit neighborhoods to make sure that they get those voices at the table. So I agree that there's been some things that they've had to sort of hustle around and fix, but I'm really encouraged with the amount of work that they've been able to do. I have a kind of busy job, and I'm not able to watch the commission as much as I would like to, but one of the things that impressed me that as I was watching a little bit of it last week was that there was a moment, I watched pretty much a whole day of the session over the weekend, and there was a moment of tension, but that moment of tension was between two different commissioners, both who felt very passionate about drawing good maps that represented the people of Michigan, voters in Detroit, African-American voters. They just felt different about it. And they had some conflict, which, by the way, we've never seen before. We don't know how maps got drawn here in Michigan. It was done behind closed doors with a few politicians and political operatives, and we've never actually seen this process happen before. I think the transparency is key, and it's key to helping us grow and do better.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
No, I was going to go to you next. I'm preparing.
Okay, I'm like,
I know
okay.
you got an Instagram life to preserve. We know. So we know that the 2022 elections in Detroit did not necessarily go as folks wanted them to go in these new districts. But we did have a new representative, Kimberly Edwards, win in one of these 8 Mile Crossing districts, who was kind of previously unknown against an incumbent. And so that might raise the possibility that it wasn't necessarily the voters that were averse to black or black preferred candidates, but that part of this is on the candidates themselves to step up and the organizers and the parties to support candidates that black voters support. So how much is kind of in the realm of elites and candidates to help solve this issue?
So yes, Kimberly Edwards' seat, I mean, I think there was an opportunity there, and I have to say I am aware of the inner workings of former Representative Lamar Lemons, who previously served, and him working in that race and understanding the number makeup of how sometimes, just like with Senator Betty Jean Alexander, there are opportunities in which you can engineer a win when you were able to not split the vote and you have other candidates competing against themselves. So there are some dynamics in that race that I think helped. But you're absolutely right. I think the lesson that Detroiters have to learn is not oversaturating the field. Unfortunately, oftentimes you have a number of African Americans who jump in a race as soon as they hear there's an opportunity to file with $100, and everybody wants to run. And sometimes the field is so crowded that the race is, the votes are split, and it causes a challenge. But I will say, as a candidate who had a name like Gay-Dagnogo at the end, it was very challenging. I didn't have any name ID. Raising money was challenging as a black woman. And we don't always get the same support as many of our liberal brothers and sisters who live in more affluent communities. So there is a difference. There's a voter differential, something that we talked about in court as well. If you look at the Mallory McMorrow seat, and I call it McMorrow and Bullock seat, the Senate seat, the fall off of votes, the percentage change of how voters voted in the 25 or 30% that Marshall had versus what Mallory has. I mean, it's clear that she was going to out-fundraise him, and her voters were going to outvote the small percentage of voters that were just there from Detroit. So there are a number of dynamics that have to be addressed on crowding the field with candidates. But there are also some issues that sometimes you can overcome. Donovan McKinney's seat. He was detained by the police, I believe, 3 times. It's not a good feeling when you're out campaigning and your folks are pulled over by the police. I was out some years back. Gosh, I forgot where I was, but I was out, and it's thank God I use social media the way that I use it, because I actually was able to share that with our attorneys to put in record that the police was actually called on our canvassers. So when you're a black candidate and you're running in areas where people who don't, take kindly to you knocking on your doors, you got to go out of your way and then even try and raise enough money to pay for white canvassers. Like, it's not easy. And these are things that people are uncomfortable talking about, issues of race and issues of economics of how we run. We got to start being comfortable with talking about race so we can come to terms that we're not blaming anyone individually, but the system is not serving us well. Anytime I got to go as a black woman and say, okay, if I got to run in Grosse Pointe, listen, I got to find as many white friends I have to go and knock on the door in Grosse Pointe or pay somebody so that the door at least gets open so they can hear the message. And that's the things we have to consider. So we know that the goal of this whole process, again, I believe that the intentions to some degree with the referendum were pure. I don't know if they were pure with my party of choice. And so it can't just be about winning majorities. It has to be about getting the best candidate, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 has to be adhered to. And anytime we start trying to engineer seats just to have a majority, we have all failed, regardless to what side of the aisle we hailed from.
Thanks. We're going to get to your questions next, but I got one more for John, because he's looked at the proposed maps very closely. So I just want to ask about the other considerations, because I know that the courts were also asking the commission not to affect other districts to the extent possible, and also to maintain its other criteria like partisan fairness. So I want to hear what's going on with the ones they've withdrawn so far.
Well, the easy one first. They are good at population equality and contiguity, so all those, there are some criteria that are easy. On partisan fairness, there have been concerns, but I don't think this is much of a partisan battle, in that the districts to be withdrawn are democratic pretty much however you cut them. If you really try super hard, you can get one Republican district that will go Republican in elections in which Republicans do very well. It has to be something like the Trump 2016, Trump Clinton. But that's about it. So it's not, I don't think the data supports a Machiavellian plot by Democrats just carving out Detroit in a way to get more blue seats. These seats are blue however you cut them. So this was bad for the reasons clearly expressed to the citizens. But it wasn't sacrificing those residents for the sake of blue majorities. As far as I can tell, it was sacrificing those residents for no upside whatsoever. And the maps are going to result in either exactly the same partisan balance or a competitive seat that are around the Grosse Pointes that might go Republican sometimes, but probably not in most elections. So you are valuing, in terms of partisan considerations, over half a seat. Over how far the remapping goes, that one is tricky. The court very clearly said, the order said that they need to withdraw 7 districts in and around Detroit, plus any other district as reasonably necessary. Of course, if you withdraw here, it's going to impact the things nearby. The commissioners are interpreting this mandate in a very expansive way that, well, once we're at it, it's, again, by analogy, if you get the mandate to clean this half of the living room that is kind of dirty and dusty, and you get there, once you're cleaning it, you want to, well, but now I see dust there and there and there, and then in the end you want to clean the whole house. That's a little bit what I feel. There's kind of a mission creep. So the commissioners in some of the maps are also fixing districts for good reasons, but it is not obvious how those reasons fit within the mandate of the court order. So it's unclear how far you can go. On the other hand, you can argue, well, similar problems we were drawing under the Adelson advice to draw in a particular way. These 7 districts we fixed, but we also drew those other districts over there in Royal Oak and far west all over Detroit. So the commission is struggling with the, once we're at it, do we fix Dearborn, which is kind of inexplicable how it's drawn right now. So there is the question of, do you adhere to, I've been told to do this, this is all I do, or, well, once I have them up, let me keep going. And in some sense, it's easy to like the maps that fix more districts better, but there is a concern, and the commission's lawyers were constantly pushing back and saying, careful, because you don't have a mandate to withdraw the state. You have a mandate to withdraw 7 districts plus others as reasonably necessary. Is it reasonably necessary to do something around Farmington that wasn't quite to your liking in the previous one? How is that reasonably necessary to fix Corktown? So that's a tension that the commission will be resolving in the next few days, and if they do not resolve it to the court's liking, well, then it will be resolved in the next few weeks through a broader process. Very briefly on as to why the commission was seen as a success nationwide, because nationwide the attention, sorry to say, they don't care that much about our House districts. They care about the congressional district, and the congressional map was a success. The congressional map has not been struck down by this court case or any other. It resisted court challenges. It was perceived as fair according to most measures. It drew plaudits of all the experts and people in academia. So if you look at the Michigan Commission only through the congressional, which is what the nation looks at, so people in Arizona, people in other states, people in Ohio, of all places, look at, oh, I want that. What happened with the legislative districts was something that has a lot more problems than the congressional districts. So the commission definitely has one thing to be proud of, that one map for the congressional districts that was a success, and we should not forget that.
I'm still not happy with it, though.
All right, let's open it up. Please raise your hand and give a chance for Tony to reach you.
Yeah, I'm just curious if anyone can answer the question as to, how someone like Adelson, that, a former DOJ attorney and, ostensibly an expert, especially when it comes to, Voter Rights Act and how to draw these districts. I mean, how could you get it so wrong? And I'm not asking anybody to, obviously to impugn his moral character or anything, but it seems to me it's a little confusing how he could be, so obviously wrong, apparently from what it sounds like. I'm just wondering if anybody could address that.
That is an excellent question, and I'm not seeking to impugn his morality or anything like that, but there were numerous warning signs and individuals and groups who called attention to Mr. Adelson's reputation and his efforts, which I'm going to slightly disagree with John on it being a Machiavellian tactic. I think the deck was stacked in favor of Bruce from the get-go, because he had this novel theory about cracking and how it would benefit one side of the aisle. And his issue ultimately was he took it too far, and it was so brazen that it couldn't help but be struck down by a court. And I think making sure that voices are listened to when they bring concerns about people like Mr. Adelson, which I was one. I spoke very loudly about Bruce being the wrong choice, pointed to evidence, pointed to things that some of his colleagues had said about him, and some of his experience and problems in other states like Arizona. And that was summarily ignored by the commission and the staff. And I think probably a lot of that was because it was me calling question about this issue. It was ignored because, well, he's just a Republican. He's just trying to blow this thing up. That's frankly wasn't the case. It was because having been part of that process and learning about redistricting from when I got involved, those types of things are setting yourself up for failure and for litigation, and it's ultimately got us to where we are. And so I would say broaden the process for how we find somebody to hire for this. And I do like what John said about maybe, instead of having just one, have additional folks who are going to provide, whether they agree or their counter arguments, at least they are getting additional advice from just somebody who may have impure motives.
And we did, the commission first heard about Voting Rights Act experts from a commission, from a panel that we organized with 3 different experts, and we did offer over the summer to submit anything for consideration to those experts and another set of experts. But once you got an internal expert who thinks they're in charge of the process, it's hard to...
Right, if I may, so to that point, Edelson, it's crystal clear. Anybody that has not read Judge Kethledge's opinion, please read it. When you read it, you're going to be left in such awe, shock and awe, that the evidence is clear and convincing that this dude had an agenda, and his agenda was to mislead. First of all, and you got a public body that you're going into secret meetings, you ask them to sign a non-disclosure agreement. When they tell you they're uncomfortable with going lower, he says, no, go lower, lower. So, and then what was the pool of candidates? What were the names, the list of names of experts that were submitted? Was it 1? Was it 2, 3, 4, or 5? I think it was a very, very, very small pool to begin with. So I hate to come with conspiracy theories, but there was an agenda day 1. And so I take issue, and I'm glad he resigned. On court record, I believe our attorney said that the court does do recording inside the courtroom. After the testimony of former Rep. Lamar Lemons and former Rep. Virgil Smith, he chuckled with this very sinister laugh and referred to them as boys. I sat maybe 6 feet away from him. So he should have never been selected as an expert in this case to begin with. And I really take issue with the process. That has to be cleaned up. If this is going to be a model across the country, I'm a former science teacher. I can't grade science projects or any other project without having a rubric to fairly evaluate if there was a hypothesis, if there was a data, if there was evidence, if there was more than one trial. So you can't fairly select an expert without some measurable degree of determining, do they possess the necessary criteria to demonstrate efficacy? And while he was an expert in knowledge in the field, he certainly was not or is not an expert in implementation and guidance for the commission.
I just had a quick follow-up question for John, talking about how the new draft maps the commission is working with look. Obviously, a lot of them look a little different from the strategy of pulling districts out of the city center and going into Macomb and Oakland counties. And could you talk a little bit about the commission's new approach, making some of these districts more compact, and how, and I know you mentioned it doesn't necessarily impact partisan fairness, but how the new direction of the commission might look in terms of compactness?
Thank you. Yes, following up briefly to what Tony said, I do have in writing in my own work pointing out that that doctrine of lowering does benefit the Democratic Party elsewhere. Is how they split Ann Arbor, Grand Rapids, Lansing, that was beneficial. How split Detroit doesn't matter, who's going to go Democrat anyway. It is elsewhere in the state that had a partisan consequence. Since we're not redrawing the parts of the state in which this has a partisan consequence, I reiterate that this particular redrawing, I believe, has no partisan battle attached to it. The doctrine itself, as applied elsewhere, has consequences, but we're not debating how to deal with the elsewhere. That's I think that comes closer to what I meant to say, and probably we're closer to agreement. And I have that in writing. It's not a new
Just came up with it on the fly.
It's, on the new approach is normal. I submitted my own map and I like it a lot better than the ones they're drawing. Callum didn't like it because she likes her own map a lot better, but it has gone to a normal debate of, well, I like my map for these reasons, well, I like mine for these reasons. This week's maps to me look the sort of normal, the process that I envisioned when I was volunteer for Jamie's organization. And they look like, well, I like this way, or should we do the lecture? Does St. Clair Shores have more in common with this point or with Roseville? Where does Harper Woods go? Is it kind of part of Detroit, although it isn't, or is it like the Grosse Points? Those are debates that I was expecting. They look normal now, and then we can look at nuances. Gone is the Adelson doctrine with these things that I was thinking. This should not be part of the debate. So why am I seeing these weird things that go into far away? It's like an expedition. The Detroiters go on a march and see how far they can go.
Yes.
That made no sense whatsoever. And now we're over things that make sense. I look at Water Lily, Spirit of Detroit, these are maps. And then like, well, okay, they do this, they do that. So now it has abandoned the Adelson doctrine, it has returned to normal. And we're having normal debates over whether which community does Bangla Town belong with Hamtramck, or should it be with other parts of Detroit, Palmer Park. I don't know well. I don't know Detroit well enough. There people will know better. But this is now realms of normal, and we can argue over normal. Whereas what was happening then in 2021 was more pull my hair and scream at laptop to visit frustration.
Thank you. First of all, I think that I never lose sight of the fact that we have much fairer districts right now than we've had in 30 or 40 years, and that would not have happened if we would have kept this in the hands of politicians. I testified before the commission in 2021, and I always asked for fair maps, fair statewide partisan maps, and that didn't mean I was advocating for Democrats. I think there's this notion that if you advocate for fair, partisan, statewide maps, that's a partisan issue. And simply, if Michigan is a 50-50 state, which we more or less are, control of the legislature ought to go back and forth depending on who is, probably who's winning at the top of the ticket, and that hasn't happened. I guess my question, one of my questions is, when I look at the maps now on the website, I've got no capacity at all to assess them and to know enough to, tell the commission you ought to pass Daisy or Spirit of Detroit or whatever. Is there any system in place that can let a regular citizen really assess these?
Read our report. I work to inform people like you. So IPPSR report on the current maps. Version 4 was yesterday. As soon as they have new maps, they will be version 5.
And yeah, we do have those statewide partisan fairness metrics, and the commission also listed some today. But I think what John was just saying is that because we're only doing a small part of the state, it's just not having a huge effect on any of those measures.
Matt, how can you find the report?
At ippsr.msu.edu.
Or at the commission's website, they posted it too, as material.
Here, this many people, we must have questions. Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted to say to Ms. Sherry, thank you so much for speaking truth and having the uncomfortable conversation. It's not always easy to have the conversation about race and how it impacts us all and how it impacts the democratic process. So as somebody who has been shouting from the rooftops some of the similar sentiments that you expressed today, I want to say thank you for doing so. I really appreciate the honesty and the transparency and putting it out into the atmosphere and demanding better. So we appreciate the work that you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you. That means a lot. Thank you.
And on her birthday, no less.
After John made a comment that the congressional map is not an issue, I noticed Sherry had a little bit of a dissent. When I looked at those maps, and again, I've been looking at this from a distance, I started following this issue about 60 years ago. The two congressional maps didn't exactly strike me as being fair to Detroit. I just wonder what your thoughts really were on that subject. And one quick thing, you talk about the partisan gerrymandering, the maps in, I think it was in 2000, they were so gerrymandered that Democrats won 2 of the 5 races in the House.
So I have a teacher's voice, so while he's walking with the mic, the joy of being a teacher. I thank you. You're my second new best friend here. So I went to Washington during the Congressional Black Caucus and was able to connect with other folks across the country who were having some of these same redistricting issues. Alabama being one of them, and addressing their congressional seats. We know that there's been population shift. We know that the numbers have still been debated about the census, but we still don't have a majority-minority congressional seat. I'm looking for another bite at the apple on that as well, because based on our population, we are due one majority-minority congressional seat, and so I think that's important. But I will say this to the gentleman up here that was talking about you see them as the most fair partisan-wise. I get that partisan component, but racial component, and as someone who has watched the Senate over the years to go from the last set of 3 to now 0 African-American senators representing the Detroit area, that just doesn't sit well. And so, we have to ask our question, is it truly fair? And not for the sake of who gets their team in, but what are we in the democratic process? What are we as Americans? When we limit voice, when we limit representation, when we limit the understanding of the plight of people who are fighting for affordable auto insurance, who are fighting for affordable housing, who are fighting for a myriad of issues to not have their voice. When I first came to the legislature, I came as a former Detroit public school teacher fighting for the survival of Detroit public schools. And if you've watched the history, and many people haven't, I get it, we came from a 200,000 plus populated school that was thriving through state takeover. If you just go by what you read in the newspapers, you would assume that we have this lion's share of educators who are not properly educated. I'm a master's level teacher that ultimately ran for office simply to come and fix education. And as God would have it, it was during the what they call the bailout of DPS. It wasn't a bailout. They hurt our district, and then they turn around and now we have to be put in this new construct. In many instances, at one point, it was going to be without a school board until me and Senator Jeff Hansen had many rounds back and forth. And thankfully, I had his respect as a former teacher to say, not on my watch will we have the largest district in the state of Michigan, but not now be subjected to not having an elected school board. That's just not fair. So you've got to have representation in the rooms to advocate for issues that are representative of the area that people come from. And so you can't have Brightmoor with Birmingham. You can't look at Jeff Chalmers and say they can just be with Grosse Pointe because they all have yachts. That's not true. So that's why it's important to have affairs. Now I will say this, serving, I would like to have seen the day, or would love to see the day, that we can get 50 Democrats and 50 Republicans. That way we can really have some true collaboration and getting to know each other and working for the best interest of the people, not for our next election. And that's what's missing in this whole process. People are fighting just to be elected and leaving the citizens on both sides of the aisle in many instances to pick up the pieces. So it's partisan fair to your perspective, but as a black woman, it's not racially fair.
I think Jamie has asked for the last word, but everybody's going to stick around to answer questions individually if you want to come up afterwards. So let's hear from you.
Well, I just want to make one point that partisan fairness and fair representation do not have to be traded off with each other. They do not have to be compromised. There were maps submitted during the original process that met all of the constitutional criteria. All 7 did a better job on representation than the maps that were adopted and were better on partisan fairness. One thing that we do need to do, and we're about to release a report that we worked on with Moon Duchin from MGGG about some recommendations. And one recommendation is how to make the public input, including communities of interest and maps, easier for the commission to use and integrate so that they can actually use all that input that they're getting effectively. But those Promote the Vote maps that were turned in or before met all the criteria. Promote the Vote just did 3 sets of maps that apparently the lawyers for the commission have asked them not to put forward, but that did better. They were 3 of the 4 that passed the commission's VRA analysis, and they did better on partisan fairness than any of the maps that the commission has come up with. So it can be done. The trade-off is artificial. It doesn't have to happen. We can get maps, and I'm confident this commission can draw maps, adopt maps that meet all of the criteria that were in the amendment that 61% of Michiganders supported, and 80% of Detroiters, by the way, back in 2018.
Good to end on a high note. Thanks to everyone. And I thank folks for sticking around if you want to ask questions individually. Thanks for coming.